Great love for the least. Have you ever thought to yourself, this person isn't worth my time? Have you ever said in your heart, this task is beneath me? Have you ever felt the temptation to inform someone that you are a very important person whose time actually matters, and you deserve their utmost care and attention, pampering you in all the ways you deem necessary? Behavior indicates belief. And I've witnessed a few people behave in such ways that revealed deeds were their beliefs, whether examined or unexamined, conscious or unconscious. I've seen people comfortable, well-fed, well-dressed, slightly drunk, and dazzled by a display of brilliant luxury. I've seen these people walk past rows of dirty, broken bodies begging for scraps, and the affluent chose to remain willfully ignorant of the human souls littered about their feet, not once looking down to acknowledge their humanity. That's why I hate Vegas, actually. Been there, done that, right? Yeah. Sadly, I heard one of my ministry professors tell about children creating a paper mess in a Sunday school room with a hole punch. He shared with my class how he set the members of his congregation straight. He lectured them that he didn't go to school for X number of years to run a vacuum. And he presented this to us, ministry students, as if this were an example that we should follow. I was a bit shocked and appalled at his failure to see the disconnect between what he was teaching us and what Jesus taught. And I've seen ordinary people talk down to other ordinary people with such contemptuous entitlement that you would think they were royalty speaking to lowly subject. I demand to see your man, right? We've all heard that, seen it, maybe said it. There is a common thread running through all of these scenes. This person isn't worth my time or even my acknowledgement. This task is beneath me, which is to say I am above it. I'm kind of a big deal, and what I need and want matters most. What you're hearing is the language of self-importance. And many, if not most of us, are incredibly fluent. I can hardly think of a less Christ-like orientation toward the self and others. It is remarkably anti-Christ in the truest sense. Who is the greatest? Well, I am, naturally. Unfortunately, most of us haven't the slightest clue what actual greatness entails. And that's yet one more reason we need Jesus. He provides us with both an explanation and an example of such greatness. As we read today's lectionary passage, I want you to hear three big ideas. There's the idea of this incomprehensible sacrifice. Incomprehensible sacrifice. Then there's the allure of comparative and superlative. The comparative and superlative. You guys remember those words from grade school, right? The temptation of those things. And finally, there's the lesson about welcoming the typically unwelcome. Listen now for God's holy word. I'm going to shut up. God is going to speak. Okay? Listen. Mark 9, 30 through 37. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again. But they did not understand what he was saying, and were afraid to ask. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, what were you arguing about on the way? But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, whoever wants to be first must be last of all, and servant of all. Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. Thus concludes the reading of God's word. An incomprehensible sacrifice. In 7 verses, the scripture presents us with 3 seemingly distinct matters, but after careful consideration, it becomes apparent that these issues of sacrifice, greatness, and welcome, sacrifice, greatness, and welcome are fibers of one fabric. First, there is the incomprehensible sacrifice, as in the disciples failed to comprehend its significance. Of course, we can't fault them for this. They had not the benefit of hindsight that we have. For them, these words told of something yet to happen. And that something did not align with their expectations. For us, these words recall a familiar history. And so it is like talk of people flying in the Middle Ages versus today, right? Back then, inconceivable. Now, commonplace. Sacrifice is very near the heart of the Christian faith. With a bit of explanation, we could even say it is the heart of Christianity. Hence, the cross on my back. Not to mention, sacrifice is the defining attribute of God. The central issue of our faith is love, and sacrifice, or the giving of oneself, is its practical manifestation. That is love in action, sacrifice. Jesus said to his disciples, the Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again. And the gospel says they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Imagine one of them had the nerve to ask for clarification. What might Jesus have said? In the next chapter of Mark, in a passage strikingly similar to today's, James and John try to secure positions nearest to Jesus' seat of power. The rest of the disciples become angry, and Jesus says to them all, whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. Sound familiar? Like something maybe we just read? For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. Perhaps they could have avoided the division and discord had they found the courage to ask Jesus for clarification the first time this issue arose. But in this second instance, Jesus makes the fact of sacrifice plain. There's more to the betrayal, execution, and strange promise of rising again than is apparent on the surface of things. Jesus' life is not being taken, but given. And it is a ransom. This concept is from a world unfamiliar to us, the ancient Near Eastern slave trade. Ransom was the price of a slave's freedom from bondage. Jesus was essentially telling his disciples that he was giving his life as the price for humanity's freedom from sin and death. And this ransom, this giving of himself, this act of self-sacrificial love, was something the disciples could not as of yet comprehend. They were afraid to ask about it. So instead of learning more about giving of oneself, they began to argue about giving for oneself. Each wishes to claim for himself the title of greatest, and presumably all the powers and privileges that would come with it. Thus, we arrive at our second big idea. 1, 2, we only have a third left. It's going pretty fast, right? Okay, stick with me. The allure of comparatives and superlative. Consider the following adjectives: great, greater, greatest. If you remember back to your early elementary years, the latter two are not ordinary adjectives. They are comparative and superlative, respectively, and they're reserved for the extraordinary, whether extraordinarily good or extraordinarily bad. It's good to be strong, better to be stronger, and best to be stronger. Bad to be weak, worse to be weaker, worse to be weakest. They are for the better and the best, as well as the worse and the worst. These better and best adjectives come in very handy for setting everything and everyone in its proper place. We'll put the strongest and fastest in the game, keep the weakest and slowest on the bench. We'll put the prettiest on camera, the funniest on stage, and the friendliest behind the counter. Jack is wealthier than Jill, so we'll invite Jack to the wedding, hoping that he'll bring a better gift. And Rebecca is far sicker than Samantha, so we'll give her the only available ICU bed and hope Sam can hold out for the next one. We don't only use these better and best adjectives in harmful, cruel, or inconsiderate ways. As with the triage example, it's a sad reality to be sure, but it is the best practice we've managed to come up with so far, the best of the bad options available. The trouble with these adjectives lies in assigning different worth to people based on their position from greatest to worst. The problem arises when we equate stronger or smarter or wealthier with better, with worthier, or worth more than others. Or in the case of being the greatest, worth more than everyone else. In a system that values people based on their position from first to last, highest to lowest, the greatest is the most valued. They are worth the most, presumably most deserving, and certainly entitled the most. When we picture the disciples bickering about who is the greatest, we shouldn't think of little children claiming superior athletic, artistic, or intellectual prowess. It wasn't as trivial as, I can run faster than you can, right? Instead, we should think in terms of a very adult world of power politics. These are less like little kids competing on the playground and more like coworkers jockeying for the same promotion. Why would this even enter their heads? And what would be their motivation for contending with one another in this way? A chapter earlier in this gospel, Peter correctly identified Jesus as God's anointed one, the Messiah, the Son of God. Because of our historical and cultural distance from the events recorded in the Gospels, we tend to hear the familial language and stop there. Jesus is God's Son. We think of the parent-child relationship, and that's not wrong, but neither is it a complete understanding of these terms. These were royal designations. They were titles traditionally applied to Israel's monarch, such as David. And the titles Son of God and Savior of the world were also designations for the Roman emperor. The god mentioned being Jupiter, of course, or Zeus to the Greeks. This language was that of real world politics. They were talking about kingdom and kings and kingdom administrators and divinely appointed rulers. And none of this was metaphor. It was all very real, very tangible, very material. The throne signifies power. Those closest to the throne tend to have the most influence, prestige, and wealth. This argument was not an insubstantial or trivial matter for these disciples. They imagined that Jesus would sit upon an earthly throne soon enough. And when he did, a hierarchy would form. Perhaps it already had. Earlier in the same chapter, Jesus took not 12, but just 3 disciples to the mountain to witness his transfiguration. Only these 3 received the privilege of seeing Jesus' unveiled glory, not to mention the spiritual heroes of antiquity, Moses and Elijah. Is it any wonder they were concerned about who would rule over whom in the coming kingdom? However, they must have sensed that this behavior was unbecoming and beneath not only them, but anyone seeking to live a truly spiritual life in service to God. When Jesus asked what they were arguing about, they were silent, suggesting that they were embarrassed and perhaps a little afraid. It's at this point in the story that Jesus sets them straight about what it means to be great in God's kingdom, against what it means to be great in the typical worldly sense, welcoming the unwelcome. Point 3. In response to their telling silence, Jesus sits down and says, now look, guys, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. The gospel tells us that he took a little child in his arms and presented this little one to the disciples as the way of God, the way to God, the means of receiving God into one's life. He said to them, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. You hear that transitive property at work. If X equals Y and Y equals Z, and X equals Z. It is in welcoming the child that we receive God. But you must understand the content of the symbol, child, was quite different in Jesus' time and place, at least in theory. In practice, and the truth of our affection, or lack thereof, we might be more similar than we want to admit. You see, theoretically, we cherish our children. We say things like, the children are our future. We hold them up as images of unspoiled innocence, snow yet unsullied and unspoiled by the filth and rot and pollution of this fallen world. But it could be that the people of Jesus' time and place were just more honest about their genuine thoughts and feelings regarding children. The people then and there regarded children as little better than dogs. They were needy, helpless, unhelpful dependents in a world where life was already too short and too hard, and resources for its continuance were too few. Children were a nuisance, hindrance, an interruption, an inconvenience, a liability. Popular opinion was that children possessed little value until they were responsible, contributing adults on whom others could depend. As I said, we might profess a different view of children, but I've known many folks who practice more like these guys, right? More like the ancient folks in that ancient society. So then, how now do we hear the words, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me? Jesus isn't talking about attending a baby shower or a first birthday party. He isn't talking about the abstract and faceless children are our future children. And in a significant sense, Jesus is talking about a group far more extensive than just children. He's talking about the least as opposed to the greatest. See the connection? Whoever welcomes those whom others regard as worthless, grungy, street creatures welcomes me. Whoever embraces the needy, helpless, unhelpful dependents receives me. Whoever makes time and makes room for the annoying one, the hindering one, the intruding and interrupting one, the inconvenient one, the burdensome one. Whoever welcomes that one welcomes me, and in so doing, receives God. Now let's tie it all together. The hard to understand sacrifice, the allure of better and best, the welcome for the unwelcome. Love involves some form of self-giving, and this is a sacrificial act. You give your time, your attention, you put your life, your plans on hold for someone else. You give your money, food, place, and resources, things you could have and sometimes maybe should have kept for yourself to another. All of this is love, it is sacrifice, and it is incomprehensible to some folks. It's often those same folks who are greatly concerned with greatness. They don't speak the language of sacrifice so much as the language of investment. They invest in the good favor of their superiors, hoping that these people, better and best people, will elevate them to a position of better or best. That is, they invest in themselves in this way. And they deem irrelevant, if not worthless, those who are incapable of elevating them in this way. You know, the world's need, helpless, dependent children. But this is antithetical to Christ's way. And it is not how one achieves true greatness in God's kingdom. For the world Jesus came to save from itself, the greatest is indispensable, while the least is disposable. That's the way of the world. A key component of Jesus' salvation is this different way of seeing people, recognizing their innate worth as God's children, treating them as worthy and valuable beyond measure. Each soul is indispensable. No soul is disposable. And so a Christian does not invest in their future prominence, power, and privilege. Instead, they sacrifice, giving themselves their time and attention, money and resources, care, and affection to those whom the world sees as irrelevant and disposable. The only way to achieve a place nearer to God's throne, the throne of greatest power, is by welcoming the world's children. That is Jesus' way, the saving way of Jesus. So here's my conclusion, folks. Point out any random person, and I can tell you the worth of their soul. I have that special ability. It's been given to me by reading the Bible so much as I have. I can tell you the worth of any person's soul. Their soul is worth Jesus' life. At least he thought so. So what's his life worth to you? The value you ascribe to the least among us, that's how much Jesus is worth to you. If the value is nothing, if there is a soul alive whom you would call worthless, that's what Jesus is worth to you. Nothing. I hope you look at that person who in the world's eyes is as insignificant and disposable as they come. And I hope you would affirm them as infinitely worthy, as invaluable, as priceless. I hope you'll appraise their value as immeasurable, and thus regard Jesus' life, his body and blood given as ransom, with an accurate appraisal. Because objectively, in God's eyes, his life's value is indeed greater than that of the universe and whatever exists outside its boundaries. Here is the essence of this passage in a single sentence. If you want to be great, you must give yourself to those considered least.